Today is Tuesday, June 18th, and I would like to call the Legislative Task Force on Aging to order. We do have a quorum present. There are members online. With me here today are Ms. Foley and Ms. Schneider, and then online we have other members. So the first task that we have is adoption of the previous minutes, and I'd like to know if there are any comments to the May 22nd minutes. Seeing no discussion to the minutes, all in favor of adoption, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none in person or in line, the minutes are adopted. Next, we are going to take item 3, public testimony, and move it to the end of the meeting so that we can help accommodate some hard stops for our testifiers today. So if the people who are here today in the audience, if they would like to comment on the presentations, we're going to move that to the end. Next, we have with us the Colorado Department of Human Services and the Commission on Aging, and we will begin with that testimony. When you are ready, and that will be an online presentation. When you are ready, if you'll state your name for the record and begin your testimony, please.
Hi, good morning. I'm Christine Burrows from the Colorado Department of Human Services, and I do have a little presentation for y'all. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Yes, okay. We can.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to talk a little bit more about how Colorado has structured our aging services and hopefully learn a little bit from you all as well. I think there's some things that we've done really well, and there's some things that we can certainly improve upon as we're learning through this process as well. So like I said, my name is
Excuse me, Christine, we are having just a little bit of trouble hearing you. If you could speak a little louder, that would be wonderful. Or to make sure your volume is up on your computer. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, how is that a little bit better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, my name is Christine Burrows. I'm the Senior Specialist on Aging for the state of Colorado, and I'm housed within the Department of Human Services. And I was hired to create our multi-sector plan on aging. So we have a lot of really great work done from our strategic action planning group on aging, which is, I think, where Minnesota is working on right now. And my job is to operationalize all of these exciting recommendations. Andrew sent over the questions that you all had for us, and I think I have them in this presentation. But if anything comes up, please feel free to interrupt me, and I can answer what you have. So I want to talk a little bit about the legislation that got us to where we are today, because there are two really big pieces of legislation that kind of shaped how Colorado is working on aging services. The first one is House Bill 15-1033, which is the development of the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging. This is the group that really identified that we need a strategy because Colorado's demographics are really shifting more towards older people. By 2030, we'll have 1.5 million older adults in the state of Colorado, and we are the second fastest growing population of older adults in the nation. And part of that is because we're a relatively young state, but people moved to Colorado in the 70s. There was a big migration to Colorado in the 70s, and people love Colorado, so we're staying here. So 1033 established this group. It had folks from government, nonprofit, small business, various kind of focus areas for aging, long-term care, housing, transportation, workforce, et cetera, all with the goal of collecting information. This group was tasked with doing the research to identify what's going to happen when we see this demographic shift to have more older adults. In 2023, we surpassed the mark of having more folks over the age of 65 than people under the age of 18 for the first time in Colorado's history. So that balance of people sort of across the age span has tipped more towards older people. And so we have some work to do to make sure that we can support all of those folks. After SAPCA collected all of this information and aggregated this demographic data, they were tasked with making recommendations to the state to address these findings. And I want to mention that these recommendations are very, very high level. These are 30,000 foot view recommendations. And so now my job is to operationalize these recommendations. I will say that I'll give an example of what a recommendation might look like. One of my favorites is the state of Colorado should ensure that nonprofits are recruiting older adult volunteers. Well, that recommendation came from the fact that we have a really robust nonprofit network in the state of Colorado that was hurting for volunteers, and we have a really robust cohort of older adults who are seeking community engagement work and have a lot of creative energy and skill set to bring to the volunteer table. But there was a disconnect on how to recruit them, how to recruit older volunteers. So this sort of overarching, the state needs to ensure that nonprofits are recruiting older adult volunteers, was this 30,000 foot view recommendation. Now it's my job to operationalize, how does the state ensure that nonprofits are recruiting older adult volunteers? And we'll talk a little bit about that further in this presentation. Finally, SAPCA was tasked with updating these recommendations annually. I sent Andrew our final recommendation report, the 2022 report. So if you all haven't seen that yet, I think Andrew does have a copy as of yesterday. Then in 2018, Governor Hickenlooper made Colorado an age-friendly state through AARP's age-friendly network, and that launched the Lifelong Colorado Initiative. Now, this initiative was kind of interesting because it didn't really have a place to live. It didn't have a department within the state of Colorado to live, so it was more of a guideline that, we want to be age-friendly, we want to have outdoor spaces and buildings and transportation and civic engagement for people of all ages across the lifespan, but nobody really owned the initiative, and so it was kind of this pie-in-the-sky goal. Today we have 37 cities and counties who are designated as age-friendly, which is up from 7 when we started, so we're making good progress. We kind of think of this Lifelong Colorado Initiative as this nebulous goal without anybody owning it. So that was challenging. Finally, House Bill 22-1035 was introduced in 2022 to address some of these issues. One, the Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging was sunsetting in 2022. It sunsetted with House Bill 1209. And the review committee said, hey, you have created these recommendations, you have completed your task, we're going to close the planning group. So 1035, I recognize that we needed a group of folks to help make recommendations for the recommendations that SAPCA put forth. We needed a group, an advisory group, to operationalize these. So it strengthened the Colorado Commission on Aging, which was working in parallel with SAPCA. As of 2022, it really became the Colorado lives under CDHS at this point, instead of sort of in the ether where it lived prior. And now the Department of Human Services is responsible for making recommendations and putting forth action plans to make sure that the Lifelong Colorado Initiative is enacted throughout the state of Colorado. The third thing it did was it developed a technical advisory committee, which is a group of interagency staff members who all are working on aging services together. And it created kind of a brainstorming, an idea incubator, if you will, to make sure that we can identify all older adult needs and then put forth action plans and programming to make things work. And then finally, like I said, it put Lifelong Colorado within CDHS, and it put my position in place to really operationalize the Strategic Action Plan on Aging and Lifelong Colorado into a multi-sector plan on aging. Does anybody have questions? I went through that legislation relatively fast. Does anybody have questions about that?
If I may, this is Chair Cleavorn, if I may ask just one quick question. So as I was reading through this and I was reading through your 2022 strategic plan, I kept thinking this is much like Dr. Cog and the TAC that they have for metro land use and planning. Is the technical advisory committee that you're serving under, was it modeled after that?
It's not modeled under that. The state operates a handful of technical advisory committees throughout different departments and for different strategies. So, for instance, this legislative cycle, we introduced a new disability opportunity office, and they'll have a technical advisory committee too. The goal is really just to get people from all of the agencies around Colorado serving the same people in the same room.
Okay, and then one last question, and then I'll ask you to continue on if that's, unless somebody else has a question at this moment. The other piece I was concerned about is when I was looking at the technical advisory committee makeup that was in the strategic plan, I was wondering, as this is housed under DHS, right? When you're looking at legislation that is coming forward and future-focused legislation, how do you ensure, how does DHS ensure that, you know, housing is truly doing the work that they need to do, or if land use planning is doing the work that they need to do to be future-focused on the, you know, lifelong Colorado?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is that we can't necessarily ensure that. That's one of the challenges that we have within the state structure is because we don't have a department on aging, and I'll talk a little bit about how we're structured. All of our departments across the state of Colorado are working on aging services. And so the goal of the TAC is to really work together to identify how we can be future focused and collaborate with what little budget we have for aging services. But ultimately, we're all kind of we're all working in parallel. So if somebody goes off course because, you know, their department or their agency has other priorities or strategies, it's really hard for us as a department to hold people accountable, admittedly.
All right, thank you. And one more question from Ms. Schneider. Ms. Schneider.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Christine, I just would want to make sure I'm tracking with you. Your Colorado Commission on Aging, then, is your state unit on aging for the administration of Older American Act dollars. Is that correct?
No, that's, so the Colorado Commission on Aging is an advisory group to the Department of Human Services. We have a state unit on aging that sits within CDHS that are paid staff members that administer all Older Americans Act funding and state funding for senior services, which is the Colorado funds for Older Americans Act.
And then, okay, could I ask you then, is your state Medicaid director housed where?
The Medicaid director is housed under Healthcare Policy and Financing, which is a separate agency from the Department of Human Services.
Thank you.
If you would please continue on with your presentation, and thank you for allowing us to ask these questions in the middle. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, let's talk about the state structure, because I think hopefully this will clear up some questions that you all have about how Colorado operates. I mentioned that we don't have a department on aging, and the reason for that is that we are constitutionally bound by the number of cabinet seats is constitutionally restricted, and so we are at max capacity for cabinet positions at this time point. And so we don't have room for a department on aging, unfortunately. One of the ways we've gotten around this is creating administrations underneath other departments. And so we recently launched the Behavioral Health Administration, which should be a cabinet position, but since we don't have room for another cabinet position, the BHA, the Behavioral Health Administration, is housed as its own separate entity under the Department of Human Services. So that's one way we've gotten around that constitutional restriction, but ultimately it makes things really challenging because we have, a slew of departments who are working on aging services, kind of all in our own silos. So to your point, all of our Older Americans Act programming is run through the Department of Human Services. Our Medicaid office is run through the Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing. This slide is really wordy, and that's on purpose because we have so many things going on at so many different agencies. And so that's one of the reasons why we developed the TAC in the first place, was that because we have so much going on all over the state, we really need a place to talk about it and really collaborate on this work. So the goal of the TAC, like I mentioned, is to bring all of these state departments together with this aging lens and really brainstorm some opportunities and resources. A few months ago, we talked about how we can bring together aging services and intellectual developmental disability services and what the crossover looks like, which means we need to create kind of a catalog of all of the resources that we have across the state of Colorado that are serving all of these folks and identify where the gaps are. That's one of the projects that we're working on right now. Another thing we used the TAC for was the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment just launched their digital equity plan. And so the TAC was instrumental in making sure that this plan was equitable for older adults across the state of Colorado. The strength of this group is that we have partnerships with multiple departments and that we can kind of collaborate on, what's going to work across the state of Colorado. I think that's been really helpful in identifying, kind of from a bureaucratic lens, what's going to work and what's not going to work. Unfortunately, some of the challenges with this group is that because aging lives across all of these departments, it's really hard to get kind of high-level decision makers with that aging experience in the group. We either have decision makers with no aging experience, or we have a lot of aging expertise without decision-making authority. And so that's been really challenging, admittedly, to get things moving along. The other challenge that we've noticed is that we all have separate budgets across departments. We have the state of Colorado budget, but ultimately DHS and HCPF, Healthcare Policy and Financing, and all of these departments have their own different budgets. And what has happened is we have, budget for this person to do this thing in this department. We have budget for this person to do this thing in this department, and there's not budget to overlap and crossover. So that's something that we're really working on to make things easier to move forward, and that has been really challenging. I also want to talk a little bit about how we are working with local and regional governments as well, and kind of across the state of Colorado. So if we have this goal of lifelong Colorado at the top, we have all of these state agencies who are working on separate pieces of the puzzle. So our public health department has a chronic disease state plan, the Alzheimer's disease and related dementia state plan. I mentioned our digital equity framework. We have all of these plans and action steps to get things done across the state level. And then, of course, we also rely heavily on local and regional governments and local and regional organizations to help towards these plans. So community health assessments, our AAA network is really critical in advising on these plans, our regional transportation plans, et cetera. And this isn't intended to be, comprehensive. It's just kind of a snapshot of what's going on. I think this slide would get very, very busy very quickly. And then finally, our Colorado Commission on Aging is, like I mentioned, we strengthened the advisory authority of this group with House Bill 1035. We have 19 members who represent all of the congressional districts across the state of Colorado, as well as our focus areas, workforce, long-term care, housing, home and community-based services, higher ed. There's 19 of them. We work on a committee structure, and this group has tons of expertise. Get these folks in a room and we can talk for hours and hours and hours about ideas and strategies, which is wonderful. And they're responsible for advising on the operationalization of the strategic action plan on aging. So they're the group in conjunction with me who says, okay, if the state wants to ensure that nonprofits are recruiting older adult volunteers, we're going to talk about how to do that. So are we, does this operationalization look like education and training for nonprofits to recruit older volunteers? Does this look like, potentially a database of sorts for older volunteers for nonprofits to recruit from? Or do we make a recommendation that's a little bit more nuclear and say, well, we're going to monetarily incentivize nonprofits for recruiting older volunteers, or potentially fine nonprofits for recruiting or not recruiting older volunteers. And of course, those last two are much less likely to occur, but I want to paint the picture of where we're sitting on this operationalization phase. And then the challenges of the Commission on Aging. This group is what we call a Type 2 board in Colorado, which means that they are advisory to CDHS and the governor's office. They're not advisory to the legislature, which means that if they have a recommendation for how we want to operationalize something, it has to fall in line with the governor's priorities and the department's priorities, which sometimes don't necessarily align with the commission's. An example is we had a piece of legislation come through this cycle that was going to provide an additional $5 million to our AAA network, and the commission was very much in favor of recommending that piece of legislation and supporting that piece of legislation. Unfortunately, the budget didn't work out, and so the department and the governor's office couldn't support that piece of legislation, and there was friction there. So that was challenging. The other challenge that we have is that the commission has very little budget to carry out this type of work. So I think it's really easy to say, hey, we want to do X, Y, and Z for, or we want to create a database, let's say, for older volunteers, for nonprofits to recruit older volunteers, but they don't have the budget to do that, and the department may not have that budget either. So that's been challenging. You all had asked some questions about data and about, I guess let me pause there. Is there any questions about our stake structure?
No, if you'd please continue, thank you.
Okay. You all had asked some questions about data and evaluation. And I wanted to talk about our Lifelong Colorado data dashboard. The department hired a program evaluator and data scientist right before COVID started. I think she was hired in January of 2020. So her role is to create this dashboard so that the public can look at how we're doing on these key indicators. And these key indicators are, again, that 30,000 foot view level. I think we have 170 data points that we are looking to present. Excuse me. Her focus was shifted in COVID for obvious reasons, and making sure that we could get resources to people quickly, but now she is working diligently on getting this dashboard up and running. We have a handful of data sources that we're utilizing for this, and the goal is to really make this a public-facing, usable dashboard for people. Some of the next steps that we have are really identifying what our waitlist needs look like. This is a more challenging process than just saying who needs services, because service needs change so much. I think about somebody who maybe needs a ride to the doctor on Thursday. If they didn't get the ride to the doctor on Thursday because there weren't enough providers to give the ride, they're on a wait list, but then Monday comes around and they no longer need the ride. So figuring out how we can quantify what the need is really challenging, and that's one of our big priorities right now. The other piece is economic development. We have very rural and remote parts of Colorado that are really struggling to get workers in to provide these services. So what are the economic development needs of these communities in order to provide these services? Is it a dollar figure? Is it professional development? What does that mean for Colorado? We want to look at the economic value of older adults. We recognize that we are probably going to see a mass retirement from the workforce, either by choice or as a result of age discrimination, and we need to know what that's going to do to our Colorado economy. We want to look at demographic markers and how that might impact resource allocation. One very, very basic example is that we have two federally recognized tribes in the state of Colorado, the Southern Ute and the Ute Mountain Ute. And we know that Indigenous folks tend to have higher incidence of diabetes. So as we have more older Indigenous people, will we need more resource allocation for diabetes management? On the flip side of that, we also know that Indigenous tribes tend to regard older adults more highly than other community members. And so is there a way that we can capitalize on the intergenerational bonding and reverence to create better programming across the state of Colorado? So I'm really looking at those demographic markers to inform how we can use a strengths-based approach to put forth new programming. And then finally, the budget. I mean, we have to look at how an increasing older adult population is going to impact that state budget. So we're really moving to this so what phase, is what I like to call it. We have we're going to have 1.5 million people over the age of 65 in Colorado by 2023. So what? What does that mean for us? What does that mean for our economy? What does that mean for our service provision? What does that mean for healthcare access, et cetera? We have a lot of points in time data. Now we're moving on to the analysis component. You all had asked about the budget. And because we have aging all over the state of Colorado throughout different departments, it's very difficult to quantify our total aging budget because we're segregating our resources all over the place. I asked for the Office of Planning and Budget to create an aging budget in February. The governor just signed our budget a few weeks ago, so I'm hoping that in the next month or so we'll have an overall aging budget for 24-25, and I'm happy to share that with you all once we get that. But we haven't done a complete sort of catalog of aging funds since fiscal year 17-18. At that time, it was about $1.9 billion. And this slide is horrible, admittedly, but it's very hard to read. But I wanted to just paint the picture of where all these funds are coming from. We're looking at Medicaid. We're looking at the senior homestead exemption, which is a tax credit for older adults who've lived in their homes for 10 years or longer. We're looking at old age pension, our veterans, community living centers, et cetera. Our state funding for senior services, which is our Older Americans Act state funding. So all of this kind of wraps up to $1.9 billion. Of course, this is how many years old at this point? 7 years old at this point. So I'm not sure it's completely helpful, but it at least kind of paints the picture of where this money is coming from and going to. In our long bill in the budget for FY 24-25, we did have about $200 million to support age-friendly communities and the Lifelong Colorado Initiative. So we increased our base wage for the direct care workforce, serving Medicaid, home and community-based services, looking at improving our long-term care facilities. We have some innovative financing models for accessory dwelling units. And then, of course, there's some tax credits for communities as well. So looking at transit-oriented communities and improving our public health infrastructure as well. So those are kind of what came through in this last legislative session. But I wish I had a more apples to apples picture to paint of what our budget looks like. And hopefully I will in the next month or so, and I'm happy to share that with you all once we get it. And then I think finally, you all asked about partnerships and how we're working with the community. I wanted to highlight some of the private-public partnerships that we work with. Of course, the CCOA has been really instrumental in helping advise on this plan. We also work heavily with the Next 50 Foundation and AARP. Next 50 is a foundation here in Colorado that focuses specifically on aging issues. So really trying to elevate the work of philanthropy in Colorado. We have a very slim aging services philanthropy network in Colorado. And so, the state can't do it all. The state can't pay for it all. We really need to tap into philanthropic efforts and public and private partnerships to really get this work done. C4A is a Colorado, is our network of AAAs, of area agencies on aging. We work closely with the University of Colorado and our local counties and municipalities as well. Really trying to identify who can do the work best and most effectively. All right, I went through that pretty quickly. Does anybody have questions?
I'd like to just start by thanking you for the presentation. I think you've highlighted in your work some of the things that we're very concerned about as we're looking at our work. These are complex issues that we're all behind in. I think we can kind of agree that we're all behind in this work. When I'm looking at the document, and please take this with a very positive intent, it seems to me that the work that you're doing is more reactive to an aging population as opposed to being proactive. How do we plan for aging from birth all the way through the life cycle? Is that accurate in your mind?
Yes. The goal ultimately is to be proactive at this point because we weren't proactive, 15 years ago. I think we're kind of in this, oh my gosh, we have to get things planned and operationalized quickly. And so it feels very reactive now.
Okay.
I also think that, and I take this with a grain of salt, I think a lot of the work that we do in government happens when there's a crisis. We've found it really challenging to be proactive about aging work because there hasn't been this sort of, peak crisis yet. And so the goal is to help folks identify that. I think one of the things that we've struggled with is getting all of our departments and the governor's office, and this is not a knock on the governor, this is just, I think, a fact that we live in a really ageist society. It's been challenging to get notice around what is happening with our demographic shift. We have a pie, and a lot of folks think of this budget pie as a zero-sum game. If we put more money towards older adults, other agencies are losing funds, and that's potentially the case with state budget. But ultimately, we'd like to make the pie bigger and really recognize that when we're supporting all members of community, including older adults, we're supporting the lifespan. So I agree wholeheartedly. Our multi-sector plan on aging really is intended to look at this from a lifespan model and position Colorado in a way that, we're supporting children through older adults in a way that makes it really easy to age in Colorado.
I think we share that goal. Dr. Gogler, I see that you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation. It was really great to see. It's less of a question, but more of a comment for the task force. And Andrew, in particular, as we continue updating our report, is I really would like for us to remember this presentation, and particularly the slides related to, number one, the dashboard and the sources of data that Colorado is leveraging to answer key questions. It kind of gets to the chair's initial point of how can we be more proactive and reactive. And I would argue the way we can be proactive is if we have a dashboard such as Colorado is building to answer these many key questions that come up in a more dynamic, real-time fashion where possible. Now, again, I may be unaware that maybe there is this kind of dashboard and there is this data expert here in the state that is available to do this. I'm unaware of that. But as far as if we're looking toward the future, I would argue this has to be a critical element of what we want to build in terms of infrastructure to get to this point of being more proactive than reactive.
All right.
So thank you for that.
Thank you, Dr. Gogler. Any other questions? Oh, Ms. Schneider?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Christine, for sharing all that you have. I'd like to go back to a question that I have on your statewide transportation plan. I'm guessing you said CDOT, so Colorado Department of Transportation, but then you referenced regional transportation planning. Because transportation always comes up as a topic when discussing aging services, current and future. Could you say a little bit more about that, how that flows down to regional transportation plans and then how it gets operationalized?
I am less of an expert on that component. However, Colorado is really geographically diverse. So we have, to kind of paint this picture, we have the mountains and the western slope, and then we have sort of the metro area, which is Denver, Colorado Springs, and Fort Collins, which all kind of line the I-25 corridor on the Front Range. And then we have the Eastern Plains. And so transportation plan, a statewide transportation plan isn't going to be effective for everybody across the state of Colorado. And so what we've done is really identify what each of these regions need in order to make a better plan. So transportation is one of my favorite examples for how we can be proactive about meeting transportation needs in Colorado for older adults. So in the metro area, for instance, we have all of the resources that we need to get people to where they need to go. We have Uber, we have light rail, and bus. We have a good bus system. The problem with those resources is that it's not necessarily affordable and it's not necessarily accessible, but we have the resources. So our plan is to really make those accessible and affordable to everybody. Now in the Eastern Plains, which is pretty remote and rural, they don't necessarily have all of the resources available to provide that transportation. They don't have the direct care workforce to provide rides to the doctor. And so in that instance, we're looking at really more of an economic development plan. How do we get more workers to the Eastern Plains to provide that type of service? And then when you get into the mountains and on the western slope, we have folks who may need to travel over a mountain pass to get to their doctor's office. And so in the summertime, that's usually no big deal. In the wintertime, the pass may be closed. And so it's probably not economically stable for a cardiologist to be located in Ouray, Colorado, for instance. But, you know, they can be somewhere else. So we're looking at, you know, do we need to look at rail, passenger rail, to get people over that mountain pass to the cardiologist's office? Things like that. So because we're so geographically diverse, these local plans are so critical in making these operational strategies really work for where they need to be. Does that answer your question?
Ms. Schneider?
Yes, thank you very much, Christine. Madam Chair, would you mind if I had a second question?
Please go forward.
Christine, I also was wondering about the advocacy role. When I was seeing some of your various partners and stakeholders, I just wondered, could you say a little more about advocacy? How does it take root within your process? You talked about the Colorado Commission on Aging, and one of the challenges was that you do not necessarily have any any jurisdiction over legislative items. So could you talk a little bit more about how does the advocacy for older adults and aging services get accomplished in your state?
Ms. Burrows.
That's a great question. And one of the things that we've really focused on around advocacy is examining all different types of advocacy. The Colorado Commission on Aging has the authority to write legislation, and if it's appropriate and has the authority, the okay from our State Department and from the governor's office, that can be introduced. And they are able to advocate for legislation if it falls in line with the governor's priorities and with the department's priorities. One of the things that we've really encouraged our commissioners to do is advocate on the local level to hear voices from all across the state of Colorado. We often think about advocacy in this legislative piece, but really thinking about advocating for the needs of rural Coloradans. What do rural Coloradans need from a resource standpoint, from a financial standpoint, et cetera, and how do we get that information back to decision makers? Commissioners may hold town hall meetings with their constituents in their congressional district, or many of our commissioners represent focus areas as well. So perhaps it's a town hall with long-term care administrators or something along those lines, to really get a feel for what the needs are across the state of Colorado, and then bring those needs forward to the department. And perhaps we can do something that doesn't require legislation. If we see a need for increased education, for instance, for around long-term care or advanced care planning, can the state put forth a webinar series that doesn't require a huge budget or doesn't require legislation to get things done? Ms. Snyder, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's all my questions.
So thank you. Maybe I can just finish up with a few questions. One of the biggest things that I struggle with is how are we going to pay for the work that needs to be done? And it sounds to me like you're also struggling with that. And so I'm just wondering, and this is going to be like a multi-part question, and you can, parse it out as you see fit. But what are you doing to encourage the private sector to make investments in this infrastructure? Because they also will benefit, I would think, from this required infrastructure. Are you considering tax exemptions, subsidies, or grants for the private sector to also participate in some of this work?
The answer is yes, to some extent. It kind of depends on the scenario. So, for example, we just launched a tax credit for transit-oriented communities. So the goal with a transit-oriented community is that we can improve transportation within these communities, and if local municipalities are participating in this program, they get a tax credit as well. So that's, I think, one example. That's not necessarily a public or a private sector example, but the goal is to get private sector on board. I think one of the things that like I mentioned before, we struggle with ageism. And so one of my strategies is to really paint a picture of how this is going to impact our state. We have a really low unemployment rate in Colorado, and we have a lot of older workers who were either pushed out of the workforce or want to come back in the workforce, and they're not getting hired. And so can we, as the state of Colorado, present this business case for older workers to private sector and encourage private sector hiring of older workers, which one, not only saves money for the state budget when people are continuing to work, it also helps private businesses thrive. Like, we know that older workers come with expertise and creative energy, and we know that there's a lot of myths out in the community about older workers, and so we need to debunk those. Older workers are not necessarily going to retire right away. across the board, we see an average tenure at a job of 5 years. And that is, regardless of age. So we need to be really proactive about debunking those types of myths to get private sector involved in that process as well. And that's, I guess, just one example of, we got a workforce example.
Thank you.
But also working with our philanthropic partners as well and some thought leaders to really paint this picture of how to invest in older adults, that investing in older adults is investing in our communities.
No, I agree with that, and it's a problem that's alive and well in Minnesota also. So I'm looking at your action plan, and it's rather large, and everyone, I would like you to know that it is posted online, and you can go to our Task Force on Aging website and see it as well. But when I was looking at the strategic plan, one of the questions I just kept asking myself is, who's actually going to do this work, right? There are lots of suggestions and recommendations, but as you're talking about the siloing of your different agencies, how do you see getting this action plan implemented?
You and I share the same concerns. Okay. One of the reasons that I was brought on board was so that CDHS could own a lot of these recommendations and really be the driver with other departments. Now, like I mentioned, we have separate budgets, and that collaboration process has been really challenging. One of my recommendations for the state is going to be to create a department on aging. Kind of within CDHS or within another agency, because we need a budget that's housed in one spot to get things done. Now, I think there is some benefit to having all of these other agencies working together. We have expertise. We have Medicaid expertise in healthcare policy and financing. We have employment expertise in the Department of Labor and Employment, which is great. And we need a better collaborative model. And so I think having a department on aging or a division on aging is really going to be critical in having ownership over these. So you and I think our department in general all share the same concerns.
And yeah, it's always hard to say these things, especially to someone you've invited as a guest to come and speak to you. So I appreciate your candor, and please just don't take anything personally. I wear another hat at the legislature. I serve as the chair of state and local government. So when I heard you mention, the friction between what the state agencies are, allowed to communicate by the governor's office and what they may feel that they want to communicate, there may not always be a cohesive plan there, and the friction between the work that needs to be done and the different, priorities that a governor looks at when they look at their budgets. I can certainly appreciate that. And just as a note of empathy for the position that you're in, it's been very hard for us to get state employees to tell us what the gaps are. Are you experiencing that as well? It's like once a gap is identified, now what? Who's actually going to work on that gap?
That's a great question, and I think that we're really good about identifying the gaps, and there are hundreds of gaps all across, our budget. So the Office of Children, Youth, and Families has gaps. The Office of Aging, Adult, and Disability Services has gaps. I think we're really good at presenting those gaps, and there's just not enough money to fill the gaps. So I don't mean any disrespect to our executive branch and how we're making decisions. I think it's just sort of this, we tend to get tunnel visioned on aging and aging services. And ultimately the governor is responsible, and the Department of Human Services is responsible for everybody in the state of Colorado, not just older adults. And so I think that's where the friction lies.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place for us to end this. Are there other questions online? Yeah, I think it's a good place. There are competing priorities, and both the legislative branch and the executive branch are collaborative and competitive, meaning we know we can only spend a dollar once and we want it to be in the best place possible. As I looked at your strategic plan, I was hoping to see more things upstream, like things that we could do earlier in the life cycle to help address some of the costs in the future. And maybe that's a conversation that we can continue as both our state and your state are working to resolve. I don't think one state will have all of the answers, and I think it's going to be putting our heads together to see what works best and who's tried something and did it work. So I'll invite you to further conversation with me on this topic as we move forward. And thank you so much again for being here and for your willingness to speak so openly and honestly with us. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I look forward to future conversations and future collaborations.
All right, take care and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Our next item, sorry, turn off my microphone too quickly. Our next item will be a presentation by the Department of Employment and Economic Development. And we're starting it just a little early. I understand that, Nathan, you have a very hard stop. So we want to make sure that we get any questions to you before we move on. So when you're ready, if you'll state your name for the record and begin your testimony, please.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair. My name is Nathan Ratner. I serve in government relations for the Department of Employment and Economic Development, and I appreciate your accommodation. This is the first time I've had the privilege of presenting, and I'm excited to do so about the great work that we and our staff do. I will also have a colleague joining shortly who is the administrator for the program I'm going to present on. She had a conflict and couldn't be here in person, so I appreciate that accommodation as well. I'm here to present on our Senior Community Service Employment Program, which is a federal program that we administer and that we're very proud of. We invest a lot in terms of our staff in supporting our elders in Minnesota and ensuring that they have opportunities for employment. Here she is. Lensa, can you hear me?
Lensa, can you hear me? Awesome. You're presenting with Nathan right now. Thank you very much.
Yes, I can hear you.
Could you introduce yourself, Lensa?
Absolutely. Good morning. My name is Lensa Dosta, and I'm a program manager with the Dislocated Worker Federal Adult Programs team here at DEED. And the CSEP program is one of the programs within our team's portfolio. Thank you.
Yeah, so would you like to present and I can operate the slides here for you?
Sounds good. All right, go to the next slide. Just to level set us, this is the mission of DEED. So slide 3, perfect. So CSEP, it's called the Senior Community Service Employment Program, or CSEP. It's a Title VI program of the Older Americans Act of 1965. This program is a job training for low-income seniors who are considered not job ready. CSEP is also part of the one-stop delivery system, or the American Job Center in Minnesota called Career Force. And CSEP grantees and sub-grantees are required to follow some of the rules laid out in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014. This program serves about 60,000 seniors across the United States every year, and it provides more than 60 million hours of community service to nonprofits and public agencies across the U.S. In Minnesota, it's a federal program. It's formulaic, although every 5 years we put out an RFP to renew it, and it's administered by Minnesota. There are also federal operators in Minnesota, 2 of them that I'll tell you about. Next slide. So the program goals are laid out here. It's focused on assisting seniors in acquiring new skills, work experience, contributing to the community, involving people in paid community service. That is to the benefit of nonprofits and also public agencies. And the ultimate goal is to transition people to unsubsidized employment in with sustainable family sustaining wages. Slide. So the eligibility and services provided are laid out here. Individuals who are 55 or older with an income of no more than 125% of the FPO, FPG, unemployment at the time of application, they're not job ready, and then they cannot be in the program for more than 48 months. So there are people who are in it for 20 months, they exit, and then some years later, they could potentially come back and reapply to re-enroll in the program. As I mentioned earlier, it's a service-based training. So the program pays for the wages of individuals as they are in these local agencies called host agencies. The program also provides support services. And then there are other components of the program that also help people upskill, reskill, including classroom or virtual training. And these are financed by funds from other programs that grantees operate. Next slide. Priority is always given to veterans who are qualified and their spouses, individuals who are considered 65 or older with a disability, those who may have limited English proficiency, those who live in rural areas, those who are at risk of homelessness or are homeless at the time of application, those with low employment prospects or unsuccessful job searches through career force locations. And the newest priority of service is formerly incarcerated individuals. So in Minnesota, there are 10 CSEP grantees that receive funding through DEED's CSEP. And then we have 2 national grantees, the Center for Workforce Inclusion and National Indian Council on Aging, that are considered national grantees receiving funds directly from the U.S. Department of Labor. Next slide. So community service assignments, as I mentioned, are facilitated by the host agencies who are often considered employers. Again, the maximum number of months that individuals can be in the program is 48 months. That's called a durational limit. And the average for participants in our state is around 27 months. Participants work about 20 hours a week with their host agencies in their assigned community service. And then participants are paid at the highest of federal, state, or local minimum wage. These are just some examples of community service assignments that participants have been enrolled in. We'll go through all of them. Next slide. All right, so looking at our funding levels over the past several years, funding is always usually under $2 million for Minnesota. And then we get what are called authorized positions. And so these are based on a variety of factors, including population in a specific county, as well as poverty rates in a specific county. So you can see here, numbers served in state fiscal year 23 was about 178 people. And then percentage who enter unsubsidized employment was a little under the federal target of 25.6%. We came in at 21.6%. We're looking through current data and can provide these numbers for SFY 24. And we apply for this grant every year. So we just submitted our application for the new program year, program 24 SFY 25. Next slide. So looking at our state plan priorities, again, we want to ensure that we are providing more training opportunities for more seniors. We're co-enrolling people in the many other workforce development programs. We'd like to have a closer collaboration with our areas on aging across the state, and then engaging our providers so that there are more joint sponsorships of community fairs, job fairs, outreach events to inform people of the availability of this program, and then ultimately providing more supportive services for folks in the program. Next slide. So some of the issues that continue for this program are around funding levels. As you saw, this program is pretty small. It receives a rather small amount of funding compared to our other federal programs. And there are many restrictions around how those funds are applied. For example, 75% of the funds are required to be spent in wages and fringe for participants. If grantees don't have other programs they're operating, providing support services can be a challenge, and that is a need for this population. The benefits cliff is also a big one. Many of you may be familiar with the benefits cliff. So if individuals go through the program and they're ready to exit to unsubsidized employment, depending on how much that job pays, some individuals refuse to actually accept those positions due to the fear that they would lose their public benefits. And between 2021 and 2023, many states across the U.S. have put forth some kind of a legislation to address the benefits cliff. Minnesota has not, to my knowledge, put forth any policy proposals to address this. So this is definitely something that we need to do more of in our state. And then limited program visibility is also a challenge, as well as strengthening employer partnerships. Employers are often looking for full-time people who can work full-time, but this population often chooses to work part-time. So ensuring that our employers know that this is a population that's ready to work, willing to work, but for them to meet them halfway. And I think that's the last slide. Any questions? Thank you.
Ms. Schneider, if you'd like to begin with the questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for for the information you've provided us. Do you have any specific data on services that your participants are able to provide within the long-term services and supports community or home and community-based services for elderly? I was looking at what people tend to provide in terms of community assignments, and I saw recreational leaders, health services, kitchen, bus drivers. Any of those could possibly touch on aging services, but I'm wondering if you've been able to gather any specific data within aging services being provided.
Thank you for that question. We can certainly look into where folks are being placed across the state. This is a question that we've also been getting with some of our other programs. But that data is something we can certainly pull and provide to you.
Thank you. One more, please, Madam
Please,
Chair.
Ms. Schneider.
Thank you. Also, I wondered about your comment regarding collaborations and referrals with other providers, and you specifically mentioned area agencies on aging. What is the driver for those conversations? Are the area agencies on aging coming to you? Is it the other way around? Could you just elaborate a bit, please?
Yes, thank you for that question. So in the state plan, one of the strategic goals is to create more or strengthen partnerships with agencies that support older workers, and areas on aging is one of them. So this is actually coming from both our program providers and also the Board on Aging. I think the state plan for older workers in Minnesota laid out one strategic goal around bringing CSEP to their providers, so that we're increasing program visibility, but also increasing referrals between the variety of agencies that are working on older worker programs.
Ms. Schneider, one more question?
Yeah, thank you. So in the fall of 2024, the Board on Aging and our various committees will be hearing from our area agencies on aging regarding their plans for the coming year. So could we expect then that we may be seeing some initiatives as part of the collaboration you're speaking about?
Yes, we can certainly have a conversation with them, but yes, it would be excellent to talk about initiatives that we're going to be doing together and see how they are going.
Thank you. That's all, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gogler.
Yes, I had a question sent to me by a member of the Center for Healthy Aging and Innovation for this presentation. So I'm going to share these with you. Some of these you may have addressed to some extent already, but I would like you to maybe reflect on these regardless. So here are the questions that were sent to me. So do you do anything related to older worker retention and older worker hiring beyond the SEP program, which you've described here today? Do you have information on age-inclusive businesses and workplaces? Do you have a strategy around aging? And then finally, do the workforce centers offer expertise in navigating retirement and encore careers? If you're able to address any of these, that would be great.
Benza?
Thank you. So older worker retention and placements, I think is the first one. Yes, all of the federal programs, at least within our team's portfolio, do have performance measures looking at fourth quarter placement, which is retention. So across all of our programs, we do look at, including CSEP, how many older workers 55 plus are placed in employment and are retained in those employment positions. And that's actually data that we can provide to you all if you are interested. I would say over the past 5 years, we've had more than 5,000 individuals that have come, almost 6,000 actually, that have come through our workforce system, with at least 78% of them being placed or retained in their jobs. And then the second question was around age-employer, age-friendly or age-inclusive employers. That's something I would need to look into and certainly can respond. And then if you don't mind repeating the third and fourth question, I'd appreciate that.
Sure. So do you have a strategy around aging? And do the workforce centers offer expertise in navigating retirement and encore careers?
Strategy around aging, I would say that's probably a question that would be addressed by partners at DHS and the Minnesota Board on Aging. However, expertise at the local workforce areas, our grantees and also here within our team provide ongoing training to our career counselors around best practices for serving older workers, older job seekers. And that's something that we do every so often, and we are going to continue doing that. This is all to contribute to developing expertise. The U.S. Department of Labor also hosts a variety of webinars, newsletters, to help support states in helping their career navigators or career counselors support this population.
Dr. Gogler, did you have any follow-up?
Sorry, I was muted. Actually, no, thank you for that. And I'll follow up with my colleague to see if they have any follow-up questions. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate the questions. Okay. So I have a few questions. In listening to the presentation, it seems, and maybe I'm wrong, I was hoping to get something a little more robust. So I'm just going to say I appreciate the fact that you've come and talked to us about this particular program. But when I think about the data that I have seen where Minnesotans at about the age of 58 just kind of fall off the employment charts. I don't have the exact number in front of me, so I apologize for that. But, it seems to me that the best way for older Minnesotans to have sustainable income, to be able to pay for their housing, to be able to pay for their health care and all of their family needs in that midsection of life is to be able to say, what are we doing in Minnesota about ageism in the workplace? And I really didn't hear anything about how are we, as the Department of Employment and Economic Development, shifting the cultural lens of employment in Minnesota so that we're not talking about older Minnesotans in the workforce, we're talking about employees in the workforce, right? And as everyone is looking towards longevity and that we are going to be in the workplace, have needs to be in the workplace longer, what are the things that DEED is doing currently to help our employers keep those workers, not just low-income workers, but all workers? I mean, we just don't have that many young workers coming forward in the big picture. Do you have any response to that? Either of you?
Nathan, do you want to take this one from an
Yeah.
agency perspective?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right,
I
thank you,
think-
Nathan.
Certainly. I think that you raise a critical issue that touches certainly the core of the work that we do at DEED, but as well as, I would say, every agency across the state. I mean, changing cultural norms, as we all know, is a difficult process, and it requires a consistent and strategic effort. In particular, ageism, because as I think with a number of populations, it can be invisibilized and sort of out of sight, out of mind. And I think this is tragic, both for the individuals and the communities who are impacted by this, but also for our economy. We have too many job vacancies and too few workers to fill those positions. And so I think that this is something that we, and I know myself, would love to continue talking about and strategizing around. We don't, to my knowledge, have a dedicated strategy to approach this. And it's something I'm personally passionate about. My uncle is a gerontologist, and it's something that he has imparted to me throughout my life and the importance of this. So it's something that I think with a number of forms of discrimination that we highlight to our grant partners, but it's something that I would, to be honest, think that we can do more on and would love to explore that.
Okay, thank you. And then in that regard then, are we including ageism as we're looking at all of our inclusivity work across the state?
Yeah, within DEED, absolutely.
Okay.
And I think as Lenta spoke to, we address it in specific trainings and as part of all of our conversations with grant partners. But like I said, it still exists, so we can do much more.
Okay. So when we are talking about lending expertise and best practices in this area, can you kind of give me an example of what those best practices or trainings might look like?
Lenta, would you like to take that one?
Thanks, Nathan. Yes, so every 2 years, we host roundtables where we invite all of our program providers as well as the national grantees and someone from the U.S. Department of Labor. Often in the past, we've invited people who, for example, have expertise in serving older workers with mental health challenges. How do you talk to them? How do you refer them to other services? And covering best practices around working with individuals with mental health who may be considered an older worker. So it's primarily through these every other year roundtables where our counselors come and our program operators attend to hear from a variety of speakers with different subject matter expertise. The other one is around webinars. And so we hold a variety of webinars where we cover different topics to help aid with that training as well. And then DOL does have a variety of trainings or newsletters that they send out around serving older workers.
Thank you. So can you just talk to us maybe a little bit about the career work centers that you have? And maybe we can highlight some of the work that they do for ordinary Minnesotans, and maybe we can just put some of that information on the table as well. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair. So we have career force centers all over the state. It's a service that we at DEED are extremely proud of and consider it core to our mission. And so, as Lensa said, we provide a more or less continuous training on a variety of topics, and we are constantly monitoring them through a system called Career Force One, where we have constant up-to-date data for every client that is served through these programs. And so it's something that we can absolutely put a profile together for how we are serving older Americans. It's a drop-in based program, so anyone can come and receive services and support. We also have a network of community-based organization partners who provide career and training to folks who are considered dislocated workers. And so many of the groups that are served through the CSEP program also qualify as dislocated workers, and so we have those additional services that we are able to provide to them.
Okay. So as a representative who represents a suburban community, right, and we have many residents who are often affected by ageism, right? So the question I would have to you is if you would please forward to us information that I think the problem that I'm trying to get at here is how would an ordinary Minnesotan know where to go, right? And if they're, if they're being, if we only talk about older Minnesotans as lower income, with mental health deficiencies or issues that make full-time work difficult, I think we reinforce stereotypes that this happens to everybody at 58. And while we certainly need to have programs that address the full spectrum of humanity, right? We also have to not forget to talk about able-bodied, vibrant individuals who have been let go by their employer just because they've gotten expensive. So how do those individuals also tap into state services to help either retrain for something for that second career or for other opportunities, right? Like, I'm not hearing in this discussion opportunities for all Minnesotans, and I think I'm trying to pull that out of you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We have, I think, in general, a variety of means that we do outreach to Minnesotans, and largely it is through our community partners and the communities and the relationships that they have. We believe as a principle that community-based organizations and partners are better able to serve those communities than we would be as a government agency. And so it's something that we emphasize to them, and it's something that we track results on. And so in terms of how we are doing outreach specifically to older Minnesotans, I think that that's a discussion and an idea and question that I can take back within the agency, because again, our emphasis in terms of those connections is through our community-based partners.
Yeah, and so like, where would I, Jenny Cleavorn, look to find those community partners? I mean, is there a one-stop shop where I go and look and say, yes, okay, here it is, this is where I find it?
Yeah, so we have information on our website, but I think that there is space to have a more comprehensive outreach strategy. Yeah. Again, because this is a unique population with, I think, unique needs and attributes and strengths. And so it's a question that we always ask of how can we better serve all Minnesotans, which again is part of our mission. And so I think this is a topic that I would love to collaborate and focus on.
Yeah, and we would love to post a link so that people would know where to find that information.
Yeah.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can follow up with all this information and with Lensa as well.
Okay, are there any other questions? Ms. Schneider?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just looking again at your PowerPoint on slide number 7 with the CSEP providers. I see state grantees, Minnesota Chippewa Tribe, and then I see national grantees, National Indian Council on Aging. The reason for my question is that in January of 2025, the Minnesota Board on Aging is planning to launch a newly enlarged Minnesota Indian Area Agency on Aging. We're very excited about the work. It includes all 11 tribes in Minnesota, first time. And so we have a lot of things that we're doing right now to prepare for that successful launch. So if I'm dealing with some of our tribal partners and this conversation comes up, where do I send them? Do I send them to the National Indian Council? I think maybe the Chippewa tribe would speak for itself geographically, but I guess my question would be, how will I know what kinds of referrals to make?
Thank you for that question. That's wonderful to hear that this is getting launched. That's absolutely necessary. You can refer them to really any of our state grantees. What we have to keep in mind is these grantees receive a certain number of what we call slots from the federal government. They'll tell us, like in Anoka County, you have 13 slots. And so they're funded based on how many slots that they are allotted. And so you can send them to any of these 11 WDAs or even the national grantees. Additionally, what you can do is refer them to any of the 55 plus career force locations, as Nathan mentioned. And if they go to the career force website, put in their zip code, it'll show them the nearest career force location. And once they go there, they're able to speak to someone that can refer them to a counselor for eligibility determination for any of the programs for which they may be available. I think that may be the best way to approach folks that may be asking for referrals.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schneider. And then, so when we are sending people, right, we've encouraging people to go and attend, will they be met in a way that is culturally competent to, I mean, I can only imagine sending someone in where they don't know what questions they need to ask. They don't know who they're going to be talking to, or even if they would qualify for services. So we're asking people to go. Can you just kind of walk me through what that intake would look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can defer to Lentz on the actual steps that occur if they were to go to a career force center. But I think a key point of emphasis for us is that no matter who somebody is or what position in life they are, that they are met in a welcoming and respectful way, and that we provide really constant training to emphasize the importance of that, and that we take any sort of lapse or violation of that ethic very seriously. So, Lensa, would you like to speak to the
And
specifics?
I realize we're coming up to your
Oh, yeah.
hard stop, so I want to make sure that.
I appreciate that, Madam
Okay.
Chair.
Thank you, Lensa.
Sure, thank you. Yes, so our providers in these workforce development areas do receive specific training on working with diverse populations, including tribal nations. We send all of our staff here at DEED, for example, to a variety of training from, and also work closely with our tribal liaison, Kurt Croshoe, to ensure we're following best practices in serving those people. So when they go to a career force location, there'll be someone at the front desk who would meet them, talk to them, and then would be able to pass them on to a navigator we'll be able to sit down with them and work through different paperwork to see what they would qualify for, because there are many programs that are offered at these local career force locations. And then they're handed off to maybe another career navigator if they enroll in the CSEP program or in the dislocated worker program based on their needs.
Okay. Any further questions from the committee members? Great. Seeing none, I just want to say thank you so very much for being with us today and for sharing the information that you've shared. Any additional information that you have, if you would please send to Mr. George at the LCC, that would be awesome. And we're happy to share it and promote it and get it out on the website as well. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for spending your first testimony with us. We appreciate your being here.
Thank you. Madam Chair, if I can just add one more thing.
Please.
I really appreciate the opportunity for us to testify to the task force on behalf of DEED, and just want to thank the task force for their very important work for this population, and also just to encourage follow-up conversation, because any time or way that we can serve our mission better is something we're committed to doing.
Yeah. I appreciate your dedication to our state. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, so we're going to have just a few minutes of public testimony, I think. We've heard a lot today, and we've heard from Pennsylvania, we've heard from Colorado, we've heard from Minnesota, different things that are happening. So I just want to kind of open it up, maybe for the next 15 minutes, if there are members of the public who are here today who might have questions or comments about what we've heard over these last few, either today or the last few weeks. I would be open to hearing your thoughts about where we need to go forward and what you're thinking about in the conversation that we just heard today as well. Anyone from the public who wishes to testify or speak? It's quite all right. Come forward. When you're ready, if you'll just state your name for the record and give us your thoughts.
Good morning. My name is Kathy Kelso, and I was here in February to testify with Elder Voice Advocates to propose a department on community aging in February. And I was very pleased to hear from Pennsylvania and Colorado, and having read all the materials provided to us, Elder Voice Advocates is even more convinced that we must go forward with this discussion, specific discussion, on a potential department for the state of Minnesota. And this, I think, will require the entire 2 hours. And so I'm looking forward to an actual date of where we will have that robust discussion. And in my mind, of course, I've got the entire department all set up. I've got the divisions and the sections, and I have an idea who I would hire, so, and I'm nowhere near qualified to do any of that. But I think the task force has heard so much that when we connect the dots, I think it's fairly clear, as our presenter from Colorado stated today, the original group that met from 2015 to 2019 and cranked out a wonderful report in 2020 that didn't really see the light of day. They agreed. They wanted a department on aging. They knew full well after 4 years that the state required a department. And yes, they have some age-friendly groups, and they're trying to beef up the age-friendly, but you can see that even age-friendly, no matter how many groups there are in a state, they will not move the dial without having a structure and a budget and a formalized collaborative work required of all the state agencies to carry this forward. She said all the things that we could say ourselves in the task force report. And I think age-friendly, let's put it on the table, has been very friendly, but it isn't going to address systems. It will not address structure. It will not address planning that's going to take a strategic plan that covers the entire state. And that's going to take time, and it's going to take many years to execute, and we don't really have much time to waste. So I think just rather than going around the edges of this, the bullseye is we must have a Department on Aging, and I think we have to make the case in the report.
Thank you very much. I think you've said a lot of things that I've been thinking as well. You've just said them out loud. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Is there anyone? Yes, please come forward. Oh, God. Okay. When you're ready, if you'll state your name for the record and begin your comments.
My name is Leif Greta. I'm the president of the Minneapolis Regional Retirees Council. Wanted to make a couple of comments on what I heard here this morning. The first is I would want to echo what Kathy just said. I'm looking at the Colorado. There's 9 different state agencies listed here, separate budgets. And among their challenges are a lack of decision makers with aging expertise. So I would strongly encourage you all to not go in that direction. I would also echo what she said about age-friendly. My sense of that is it's a nice title. It's a nice designation, and I don't mean to be overly critical, but beyond that, it doesn't seem to mean much of anything from what I understand, what I've looked at around the state. And then I am struck when I look at the Department of Economic Development's testimony here this morning. I think I'm reading this right. They served 178 people. Now, that's while inflation has risen, placing a disproportionate burden on elders who are on fixed incomes, and as the population of elders is rapidly increasing, the number of people has declined from a low number of 251 to a lower number of 178, as has the percentage in unsubsidized employment. I'm not sure. I guess I'm just raising that. It's like, I don't quite get it, to be honest with you, what they're doing. And again, I know that sounds critical. That's because it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And I will say for DEED, they do have many programs that serve dislocated workers of all ages. And this is one federal program that they talk to us about. And we can ask them for more information that we can post. That's what I would like to see as well. Anyone else please come forward. If you'll state your name for the record.
Yes, my name is James Reed, and I'm here representing the DFL Senior Caucus, a group that began in 2006 because we recognized that the demographics of the state were shifting such that seniors would very soon outnumber children in our elementary through high school ages. We have developed through our group, eventually a large number of members, some of whom are quite expert in how the state operates. And in fact, they have produced a report. They're not quite ready to submit it to you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
But as soon as we have it, I hope to be able to turn it over to you These are members who worked within these state departments for several years, including managing and leading them. But I'm fortunately, other than to tell you that we will have that report ready for you, I'm not sure exactly when I will be able to turn it over. But be that as it may, we recognize that because of the complications of the whole questions about what to do for seniors, why maintaining services for other individuals within the state of Minnesota, particularly those in need and those who are in education, is a really quite complicated and difficult question to resolve. Fortunately, we have a few people who know something about it. I would have to say that I'm not necessarily one of those, but I will say that having become a member of the senior caucus when it formed, in fact, I'm one of the originators, we've recognized throughout that answering the questions is a high priority for the state, as well as actually our communities and even our public sector. I hope you can, with your task force, make good progress. We'll have that report fairly soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. And I would say to any member of the public, if you have a document that you've prepared or things that you would like to see, we would welcome hearing that and receiving that from you. And we would take that into consideration as we're writing our report and looking at our future plan. Are there any other comments from the members that are here today? Okay, so one of the questions that I have, as we go forward, the task force has heard a lot. We've learned a lot about structures and planning processes from the different states, Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Minnesota. And we know that we need to figure out, is there anything else that we need to hear before we spend those 2 hours in public testimony discussing what are we going to do next? What is our big plan? What would we like to see? If anybody has comments about that today, I would be happy to hear what you think we might need to further consider before we adjourn.
Madam Chair, it's Rep. Selesnikar. I'd love to ask a question if I could.
Of course, Representative Selesnikar.
Yeah, sure. There's just two things that I come to mind. Most of you know I was a nursing home administrator and ran assisted livings and for the past 40 years, and had a gerontology minor also. But one of the things that I look at, especially for greater Minnesota, is when you're looking at the aging workforce, is assuring we have a non-emergency transportation model in place, which really doesn't exist. And so looking at those partnerships, between whether it's AEOA or community partners or living at home block nursing programs, different agencies we already have in the state, to look at partnerships. And that's one of the things I want to ask DEED too, if they've followed up at all with non-emergency transportation aspects to assist disabled employees and also people who don't drive or maybe have some hesitation in the winter or whatever it is to have access to that. That's one of the things. And the other thing I was curious with the DEED, and I would like to follow up with them, is there's many people that retire that are seniors at various ages, whether they're teachers or nurses or nursing assistants, nursing home administrators, and various people that require licensure that retire thinking they're never going to want to go back to work. So they let their license go. And then, after a year of retirement and sometimes 2 years of retirement, they want to go back into the profession. But the barriers to get that license is like starting over again. And so I'm curious if DEED has looked at any initiatives to allow these professionals educators, all the different things, to come back into the workforce without having to go back, because the reality is I wouldn't either. I let my nursing home license go too after 30 years of being on call. But if a facility, if I'm retired and they need somebody to come in, I certainly don't need to take 5 years of curriculum again. And after 30 years of continuing ed every year, it's pretty stamped in your DNA of how to look for things. And even if you don't know the answer, you certainly know who to call to get the answer. So I think we're missing a piece on this pathway to relicense people in the state of Minnesota. It's clunky and cumbersome. And many people have told me when I've asked them, and they said, look, it's just easier to go work at fast food or a convenience store or something else, because the barriers to get relicensed are cumbersome. So I think we need to look into that for this committee. That would help, possibly help for substitute teaching, for nursing, for people to use and really share their wealth of knowledge with the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any other comment? Ms. Schneider?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few comments and observations as we have time for them. One of the presentations that I felt was the most riveting was last month when we had Dr. Caskey. And I believe that he has caused us to think at maybe a broader level, which we're going to need to do, and that's age inclusivity. And he really challenged me. And I think that I know quite a bit about aging, but nevertheless, I am the same person who, when I was working out of town and being gone for extended periods of time, went to a local vet clinic with my dog and said, may I drop her off before 8 in the morning? And what's the latest that I can pick her up when I get in late from out of town? I'm thinking about my dog. Now, Dr. Caskey challenged me, I should be transplanting those kinds of thoughts into this whole aging inclusivity. And I need to be starting way before my age. So that was one of the key things that really has resonated. The second thing that concerns me very much is I think we can do a better job than Colorado in producing a less confusing report when it's all said and done. But what we have in Minnesota, we have fabulous programs and worthwhile, capable, committed, passionate people. But nobody knows each other in so many cases. And so when I as a consumer need to know what's out there, I still don't know what to do for the first call. And that is to our detriment, because we have put so much time and resources into our fabulous senior linkage line. If you've ever called it once, you've already developed confidence in it. The other thing that I think we can't ignore is this whole piece of the tie-in between Medicaid, DHS, Aging and Adult Services, and Older Americans Act funding. We have to get our arms around where is the seat of the state unit on aging. And thinking about Colorado and the comments they made today and in their written documents, all I heard was a budgetary maze that I still can't get my arms around. And yet we know that the Medicaid dollars are driving a great deal of our senior services funding. So those are a few of the key pieces that I think, although we've heard wonderful testimony, we still are grappling with essentially the same key core questions. And finally, I don't want us to dismiss our thinking about age-friendly Minnesota. It's still pretty young. And we had a technology glitch when we heard from our age-friendly task force at our last meeting. They could have shown us more about their future plans for a platform. The work that they've done in developing the domains, I think, would help us in our work. And so those are a few of my general thoughts. I'm not saying that I have responsive answers for all of these things I'm raising, but I think they must be the key of what we do with our future work.
Thank you, Ms. Schneider. And I think we saw in the Pennsylvania report how Pennsylvania used those key domains as guideposts, but then they had to implement the structure and policy that would guide the work of the state. So I think there is an and space here. It's not throw everything out with the bathwater. It's, there is good work that has been done, and we build upon good work. But when you're talking about state structures, state dollars, state planning, right? That has to be clear, crisp, and concrete and measurable, right? It's got to be measurable. And so I think keeping those domains is really very helpful and useful. And it also allows us apples to apples comparisons as we measure our work against what other states are being able to do and accomplish, and what regions can do and accomplish. So I think there is value. And so I certainly want to acknowledge the value and the hard work that's been done there. But I think planning, process, budget, federal, state money requires us to have metrics and measures and accountability. And I think that's where we can do a lot of good work as well. But I think it's a build upon.
May I respond?
Please, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that we are on the same page. The other thing that I need to say is that you have, and others that I've heard from as part of this task force, have really raised my interest and awareness of the whole topic of advocacy. And I have appreciated so much of the learnings that I've gained from the advocates who have come to talk to us, and some that we may still hear from. And I really want us to keep that in our key factors thinking about how do we accomplish the advocacy and how does it actually make a difference, not just a report difference or a talking point difference, but a day-to-day, real life, one person at a time difference on our older population in Minnesota. And if we could get our arms around that, I think we could be very beneficial to our regions and communities. How do we make this actually be effective?
Yeah, and I think we heard it from Colorado today with their advisory TAC. And we heard it in early testimony from Greater Minnesota. When we do this conversation, it's not for us, it's with us. And making sure that those voices that we've heard and the testimony and the stories that have been submitted to our committee are utilized to develop the best structure and the best plan and get the very real needed resources where they need to be. And I just think it can't be ignored. It's with us. Ms. Foley, did you have anything? I feel like I always have my back to you.
No, I'm good.
Okay. Dr. Gogler.
Yeah, I just wanted to add briefly, I agreed with absolutely everything that was said here and shared on the task force. I don't know if it will be shared or would be shared. I actually went through line by line the interim report to give Andrew some feedback in terms of organization and such. And, you know, I agree with the age-friendly domains as being a useful way on top of how the report is already organized to kind of structure not only the content of some of the presentations here today, but also the recommendations. One thing I think Andrew did that was really helpful as we kind of move forward to actually delivering a final report is he's created nice tables with the recommendations that were offered within each of the presentations. And even though I understand we're not necessarily bound by those recommendations, it'll be very helpful in helping us kind of organize in the end, you know, what is the path forward? And I mean, the way I see this as really at three levels. One is the administrative/funding structural level. I mean, we seem to be moving to some type of coordinating entity, whatever that looks like. But I want to also emphasize strongly is that while that's good in and of itself, it's not as if those states that have their own offices of aging or coordinating units are necessarily addressing these issues and gaps any better than states that aren't. At least I don't have any indication that they are. So I think a core element of this is, in addition to emphasizing a recommendation around structure, funding, process, is then also really emphasizing within that new coordinating entity, what exactly should their priorities be? And that's where a lot of these presentations, you heard, from Dr. Caskey and others, that's where I think that's really emphasized. And then the third element is what, I've been saying throughout this entire task force, Chair, which you, I believe, were just mentioning, is this notion of metrics, tracking, so we can ensure that we're staying accountable and that we can compare with others, if not ourselves over time. When I think of this final report, I really think those should be the three big buckets that this report is addressing to move how we age as a state forward. Otherwise, it's going to look like every other report that's been done. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be dismissive, but it will. And so that's really, in hearing the presentations and thinking more and reviewing where we're at now in the interim report, I would strongly recommend that would be what it looks like when we're laying out the recommendation structure.
Well, Dr. Gogler, that's exactly why you're on this committee, because we want to make sure that what we do is valuable, and making sure that we do give a report that the legislature can use to draft legislation to make change real and to make change happen.
And Chair and colleagues, the public, I may very well be wrong. Maybe there is some tracking entity out there that tracks metrics on what we're doing in aging and are we succeeding. I haven't seen it and I'm not aware of it. So, and I would imagine that would be a valuable recommendation to address all of these different things that everyone is sharing in terms of transportation, in terms of what Representative Zalestakar had mentioned, in terms of are there ways to create better reentry into the different workforce settings, et cetera, so.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. So members, our challenge for our next meeting is going to be, where do we go, right? So we know what we've learned. I would encourage everyone to re-review that interim report that we've had. Look at these strategic plans of Colorado, look at the strategic plan of Pennsylvania, think about the reports that we've heard, and we need to really now start putting forward, and I think Dr. Gogler has laid this out very nicely in these three levels of admin, funding, structure, priorities, and then metrics. How would we measure and how do we make ourselves accountable as a state? I think these are places that we really need to work. Andrew, I'm sorry, Dr. Gogler.
Yeah, I'm sorry. One last quick thing is an FYI, and Andrew, I just emailed this to you. This just came out a couple weeks ago. There's a new strategic framework for a national plan on aging that the Administration on Community Living and the Department of Health and Human Services just disseminated. I think it's a good document for us to just have. I'm not saying that we necessarily have to align with what we're doing with that national framework, but nonetheless, it may provide some ideas in terms of organization or other thoughts. So
Dr. Gogler, when I was reading that report, I also had the feeling that this is like, okay, so we know these things, but it was lacking in how are we going to administer this? How are we going to fund it? How are we going to, what's the process to make that a living document? Right?
Right.
So, I mean, again, to your comment that it's something we have on the shelf that we can look at and review, but we really have to figure out how the state of Minnesota is spending a ton of money, right? And I thought it was interesting that Colorado said they're not even sure yet where all of those, where are the resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at what we're spending in, I mean, the largest part of our budget is that human service element, right? That's the biggest bucket of money that we spend. And my question is, how do we make that bucket of money more proactive and life-sustaining?
Yeah.
As opposed to reactive, right? I mean, I think that's what we're talking about for this work as a whole. So from the time that we have a child or the potential of a child to death, how do we make that life cycle the most functional for Minnesotans, getting the best use of our state resources and having the best quality of life, right? I think.
Yeah, I'm just gleaning the report, Chair. I haven't read it in depth, but I was
Yeah.
just kind of scanning it before I sent it out. And
Yeah.
it feels a lot like the first part of our interim report that Andrew drafted,
Right.
but it's kind of light on the second part.
Right,
How do you administer it? How do you prioritize? I mean, basically, how do you implement it?
yeah, yeah,
And whether they're going to take it that next step, I don't know. Generally, probably not. So they may leave it up to states vis-a-vis some grant giving mechanism through ACL to implement elements. I don't know. But nonetheless, I think it's important for us to at least know what's out there for our work.
no, I agree. I think it's important for us to know what's out there, and I think it's important for us to use it as a way of saying, okay, what are we already doing that fits within this? And then helping us identify what isn't happening as well. So it's a tool. There are lots of tools, right? Okay, members, we are approaching noon. Is there anything further that we would like to add to the discussion for today? Mr. George, do we have our next meeting set? Okay.
Thank you, Chair Cleaver. We have not finalized those dates in July, but we're looking at July 10th and July 24th. I've polled the members and these might work, but we're going to finalize those at a later date. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, members, and I really appreciate your being with us either in person or online. With that, our business for today has been concluded and we are adjourned.